I'm putting myself in a difficult position here because, in principle, I do believe that film criticism should be free of gender essentialism. That is to say, I think men should be able to tell stories about women and women should be able to tell stories about men without that gender misalignment becoming a central point of discussion. But at the same time, I also believe that having the storyteller be of a different gender than that of the story's main subject can be deeply consequential to how gender is portrayed, and that it can be profoundly insightful in what it reveals about it. Speaking as a guy here, I've always found it fascinating to see masculinity through the eyes of an outside observer. It gives me a chance to reflect on a part of my identity that I only experience from the inside, which, contrary to what you might be thinking, doesn't always have to be a deconstructive act. It doesn't always have to be about checking your gender privilege or dismantling toxic traits or whatever, but it can also be affirming. It can be like a loving hand reaching out and telling you something that you didn't even realize you needed to hear. Or at least that's what I came to believe after watching a film that became an instant favorite of mine. A film that has been widely regarded as one of the best female-directed movies in cinema history. And that is Claire Denis her 1999 masterpiece, Beau Travail.
Mon histoire est simple. C'est l'histoire d'un homme qui a quitté la France trop longtemps. Inapte à la vie, inapte au civil.
Beau Travail tells the story of Galoup, a former officer of the French Foreign Legion who has returned home where he now struggles to adapt to civilian life. He remembers his time in the desert of Djibouti, where he trained a group of men under the command of Bruno Forestier, a man who he looked up to and respected, yet whose affection he was, for some reason, never able to claim.
Je l'admirais profondément, sans comprendre pourquoi. Il savait que j'étais un parfait légionnaire. Il s'en moquait bien.
When a batch of new recruits arrive, Galoup notices one young man in particular.
Quelque chose de vague et de menaçant m'a serré le cœur. Gilles Santin, c'était son nom.
We never learn much about Santon, as the film mostly restricts us to the perspective of Galoup, whose gaze is fixated on the inexplicably charming effect that this new recruit seems to have on everyone around him, including the commander Forestier.
Santin avait séduit son monde. Il attirait les regards. Il attirait par son calme, sa disponibilité.
For Galoup, it is the beginning of an all-consuming obsession, with Santon becoming to him both a strange object of infatuation as well as a perceived threat that must be destroyed.
The Foreign Legion was not happy with my project. I don't understand why. And they said, the Foreign Legion is not happy because your film is about being gay. And I said, no, it's about being a legionnaire.
One popular interpretation is that Galoup's obsession with Santon is a signifier of repressed homosexuality, and that this is what many, if not most, of the movie's other stylistic choices are also in service of.
In school, it was always reduced to, let's talk about the homoeroticism of Beau Travail.
And when just looking at the film as a sensory experience, and especially at the way it depicts male bodies, you can definitely see where they're coming from. Much of the daily routine of the young soldiers consists of physical training, ranging from quiet meditation, stretching and yoga to more intense obstacle courses and combat exercises. And as they're going through these motions, Denis gazes upon them in a way that you just don't really see in male-directed movies. It's hard to pinpoint what it is exactly, but there definitely is a distinct sensuality pulsating beneath the surface. An undeniable haptic response that is being invoked as your eyes graze the imagery of contorting muscles, textured skins, and kinetic movements. Languid, tensile, alluring, sweaty, supple, pliable. To watch Beau Travail is to watch the human body in motion. Dylan Fugel writes in his article on the film, the day-to-day procession of existence in a corporeal form, powerful enough to inspire the most primal emotions in others. It is a depiction that, again, might be interpreted as sexualized and as homoerotic. And yet, while I don't want to invalidate that perspective for those to whom the story becomes more meaningful when viewed through this lens, I personally didn't feel like that was necessarily what was going on here. Generally speaking, I think that the labels of repressed homosexuality and homoeroticism tend to be applied a bit too quickly whenever there's a palpable yet undefined tension between men on screen, and that instead of pointing to deeper subtext, they can actually obfuscate what in reality is a much more complicated male experience, one that is shaped by a much broader range of emotional entanglements that men can experience between each other.
Can't figure it out. Do you want to be like me? Or you want to be me?
In the case of Beau Travail, what I see is a complex mix of attraction and competition, of admiration and envy, as if Galoup is observing in another man a talent, a beauty, or an ideal that should somehow be his. It is a conflicted longing, a strange frustration that we've seen in other movies as well, one that opens up whenever a man encounters another who is more charismatic, more gifted, more confident, or just altogether more admirable than he is, and which, more than anything, reveals how in their essence, in their default state, men too contain and experience a sort of inherent male beauty, that they too perceive themselves and other men as objects of desire.
Au fond de moi, j'ai senti monter une espèce de rancœur, de rage. J'étais jaloux.
It would destroy me too, because I've been a jealous person too. I know what it is.
And this is exactly what Denis also observes and captures so viscerally. Through her gaze, masculinity is not being tied to specific gender norms or character traits, nor does it suggest strongly defined societal roles. Instead, we get a masculinity that is worth beholding in its own right, a masculinity that is both ferocious and elegant, capable and beautiful, and that, in its rawest form, is just full of life and passion and wonder, like an almost mystical force of nature, burning within us as fiercely and mysteriously as consciousness itself. And I think the only reason this is so often framed as homoerotic is because men just aren't used to being gazed upon in this way, not used to seeing themselves in this way, which in turn reveals something even more important, the real reason why all this feels so foreign to them. And that is because most men have never really conceptualized qualities like beauty, desirability, and grace as a meaningful part of their own and of each other's masculinity. In other words, there is a significant part of the male experience that goes without language. Yet, as Denis seems to go on to say here, just because it is unspoken doesn't mean it isn't there, that it isn't consequential to how men act and feel, even when they don't realize it themselves.
Je radote, je rumine. Je m'en dis une parole, un petit geste.
And it's this perspective, this more sensory vision of a kind of raw masculinity, that also brings us to the real tragedy of this story. A tragedy that in many ways feels more relevant today than when the film first released. Because it's simply by portraying men through this loving gaze, by capturing their sort of spiritual essence, that the rigid ways of the Foreign Legion, the rigid ways of many male-oriented social structures, are suddenly cast in a new light as well, revealing more vividly than ever how, contrary to what they seem to do, what they promise to do, they actually do not serve to cultivate masculinity within men. Instead, without even depicting them as needlessly brutal or explicitly harmful, here they still emerge as forces that work to restrain the young man's masculinity, to confine the broadness of its fiery spirit into a much more narrow and often more submissive form. as you're watching these men's bodies and souls being subjected to all these self-imposed rituals within the harsh, lifeless desert. More than any outspoken or otherwise explicitly articulated critique, there is a distinct sensation that emerges, one that can best be described as a process of hardening. You know, it's the feeling of skin being calloused in its friction with the coarse desert sand, of bodies being roughened by the scorching sun, and of minds being dulled in endless repetition, as if they're wild hedges in need of trimming. Wild hedges whose natural inclination to grow free is a problem to be combated.
Entraînement, garde, lessive, repassage, sortie. La routine.
It might recall military boot camps from other movies, where this process of hardening is purposefully or inadvertently depicted as a good thing, as a necessary ritual of initiation that weeds out the weak and the undeserving.
We gonna weed through the quitters! Yeah, we gonna find us a goddamn warrior to today!
But with the way Denis shows this hardening process in Beau Travail, the movie I was actually reminded of was Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, where at one point the guide who's leading a group of men into a supernatural place speaks out his desires for them.
Пусть исполнится то, что задумано. Пусть они поверят. И пусть посмеются над своими страстями.
But above all, he eventually says, may they believe in themselves and become as helpless as children, for softness is great and strength is worthless. He goes on and compares the life of a man to that of a tree. He argues that when a tree grows, it is tender and gentle, and that only when it is dry and hard, that it dies. Hardness and strength are death's companions, he concludes. Flexibility and softness are the embodiment of life. That which has become hard shall not triumph. I was reminded of this, I think, because it articulates so explicitly what Denis captures so non-verbally in Beau Travail. It's the way men can so easily mistake being self-actualized for merely being hardened. How easily they think they're strengthening themselves through discipline, when in reality they're actually becoming more fragile, like the brittle wood of a dead tree. Why? Because they're latching onto a social structure that is predominantly concerned with enforcing all the things that men cannot be, that they cannot do or cannot say. In her seminal work on masculinity, Bell Hooks referred to this as the first act of violence that the system demands. Men engaging in acts of psychic self-mutilation, of them having to kill off the emotional parts of themselves. As such, it's a social structure that naturally assaults their feeling of self-worth as it renders their once inherent value into a conditional one, into something to be earned, to be competed for, often at the expense of other men, thereby instilling them with social anxiety, with a fear of being cast out, of being perceived as unmasculine by the same system that robbed them of their self-esteem in the first place. And this, in turn, can render them cruel. This is what breeds violence.
Tu es en mon pouvoir, et je te détruirai.
The thing about Santon, the charismatic young man at the center of Galoup's obsession, isn't so much that he sticks out from the rest by not fitting in, by not meeting the demands of the masculine social structure presented by the French Foreign Legion. In some ways even, it's the opposite. He is physically capable, mentally acute, and, most importantly, he seems to understand the true meaning of brotherhood. He has a generosity of spirit that supports others when they are in need. A generosity of spirit that crescendos when a helicopter crashes in the water during a practice run, and Santon jumps in to rescue his fellow soldier.
Vous avez fait preuve de courage, d'abnégation, de sang-froid. Je suis fier de vous. La Légion est fière de vous.
And yet, as much as he seems to be the perfect legionnaire, as much as he meets the requirements of this masculine social structure, he does not seem to be of it. Not like some of the others, certainly not like Galoup, whose entire self-identity is based on him being an officer. No, for Santon, it's as if there's something within him that the Legion just cannot reach, some part of his soul that won't submit, that maintains its autonomy. And this, arguably more so than a young man surpassing his skill and his status, is what Galoob cannot stomach. After all, a man outside of his dominion, a man who is more than what the Legion allows him to be, is a man who threatens the very essence of this narrow social hierarchy.
Ce jour-là, quelque chose de très fort m'écrasa et étreignit mon cœur. Je pensais à la fin. À ma fin.
And so, as the tension between the two men escalates, Galoob devises a scheme. He punishes Santon for a minor transgression, makes him walk back to base on his own. But before he sends him off into the desert, Galoob secretly sabotages the young soldier's compass, and Santon is never seen again.
On parla de désertion. Il aurait très bien pu franchir les montagnes et passer en Éthiopie.
Unbeknownst to Galoob, however, Santon is actually saved from the brink of death by a group of locals, and although we never get to see what becomes of him, his sabotaged compass does make its way back to the army base, where it betrays Galoob's violent scheme, resulting in him being dishonorably discharged and cast out from the same system that drove him to violence.
Une sanction. La Légion pour toi, c'est fini.
Your film is about being gay. And I said, no, it's about being a legionnaire.
And this brings us back to where we started. A man isolated from society, struggling for meaning and purpose. A masculinity in crisis. But now, understanding the full story, and having seen the driving forces that led him here through Denise her eyes, the true nature of his crisis is retroactively placed in a new light. To me at least, Galoob at home is no longer an admirable man holding on to the last remnants of his legionnaire discipline within a world that has moved past his masculine ideals. Rather, he's more like a sad creature that was beaten into submission by an indifferent master, and that now wanders aimlessly after being discarded, maintaining his act, his rigid routine in a performance to no one, to the benefit of no one, not even himself. I see Galoob and I see a man victimized by the very system that promised him significance. A man made small through psychological and emotional self-mutilation. A man who has become a stranger to himself and a danger to those around him. I see Galoob and I'm reminded of so many other men today, performing, posturing, increasingly detached. I think of all those ridiculously rigid philosophies of masculinity, of men chasing productivity without true purpose, of men pursuing prosperity and status without true service. I think of Matt Walsh proudly proclaiming he doesn't concern himself with home decor shopping. I think of Andrew Tate denying his son affection while prohibiting him to be afraid of bees. I think of all these supposedly masculine men posturing dominance over one another. You know, what kind of man orders white wine in a restaurant? Like, who gives a shit? I think of all those men who need ever more control over their wives out of a deep-seated fear of losing them. A deep-seated fear that they were never truly loved by them in the first place. That their partner's commitment has always been conditional on them performing masculinity better than other men. As if there's nothing inherent within them to be loved. As if their worth must be continuously proven. I think of men growing more cruel and dispassionate, men who believe themselves to be more powerful solely out of a vicarious reaction to the aggression of those in positions of power and influence. I think of Nick Fuentes gleefully relishing in his overt racism. I think of the MAGA movement descending into an ever greater psychosis, having completely surrendered any semblance of autonomy to the whims of their deranged leader. I think of men yearning for a world without compassion, a world where only might is right, as if that somehow embodies men's primal essence or ideal natural state. As if the most prosperous and most peaceful era of human history didn't coincide with one of unprecedented cooperation and diplomacy. As if everything that is good and beautiful isn't as righteous as any other force that propels men forward. A world where everything burns, where men are emboldened by the suffering of others, detached from all empathy and kindness, priding themselves for their callousness, their brutality, A masculinity that yearns for nothing, that hopes for nothing, that has been hollowed out from the inside, and now moves to the destruction of all, including itself.
Que je roule sur cette route du passé. Je regrette d'avoir été cet homme-là, ce légionnaire borné. Qu'ai-je vu des libres dromadaires, des bergers sortis d'on ne sait où. Qu'ai-je vu des femmes au pagne chatoyant dans les champs de pied, toutes ces images.
As Galoob edges the abyss towards his final act of destruction, the annihilation of a world, Denis offers us one more image, an abstraction of what feels like some kind of liminal space, someplace beyond. Here, once more, she refuses being didactic or judgmental. There's no explicit argument for what masculinity should have been instead, no clear virtues or societal roles that men like Galoob should have cultivated. Instead, once more, Denis offers us a sensory experience as Galoob's body erupts into dance, unleashing a skill, a passion, that uninhibited fiery spirit, unlike anything we'd seen him doing before. It's a beautifully tragic image of a soul finally being liberated from the prison that had been built around it. A soul finally transcending into some greater universality beyond rigid ideals of masculinity, beyond any gendered restrictions. A soul finally connecting to the freer and more joyful life that could have been.
Peut-être qu'avec les remords commence la liberté. Peut-être qu'avec les remords commence la liberté. J'ai entendu ça quelque part.
If I had to condense Beau Travail to one practical takeaway, I'd say that Claire Denis argues for a masculinity, for a humanity that is self-expansive, that always aspires to broaden its horizon and to enrich its understanding of and emotional connection to itself and the world it lives in. Great movies have always been a vital catalyst in this effort. They extend our empathy and challenge our perceptions. Finding such movies, however, isn't always easy, especially nowadays, but luckily, we still have MUBI. MUBI is a curated online cinema streaming hand-picked movies from around the globe. They offer a vast library of great movies from iconic directors to emerging auteurs, and from timeless masterpieces to hidden gems and festival favorites. If you want to continue along the subject of this video, I'd highly recommend also checking out the work of Kelly Reichardt, in particular First Cow and The Mastermind, which both offer piercing yet tender portraits of men and masculinity, and which are both just beautifully made movies. You can try MUBI for free for 30 days by using my personal link. That's mubi.com/likestoriesofold. So be sure to claim your extended free trial to start your free month of great cinema today.